Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to present the panel Style and Revolution, the fourth in the series Revolutions in History, conceived by Jennifer Lamb, Associate Professor of History at Brown University. When I received notice of my appointment as a Cogut visiting professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Brown, I was asked to consider proposing a visiting speaker to give a public talk. I wanted to bring many, and not only scholars, but also designers, including from different Caribbean islands, who embodied in their practices the connections my research and teaching stress between fashion and politics. After months of back and forth emails, meetings, and conversations with Patsy Lewis, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies Director, with Kate Goldman, the center's manager, with Leora Malsleka, the head of the Department of Theory and History of Art and Design at the Rhode Island School of Design, with Stephen Bloomfield, Associate Director of the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown, with Rich Schneider, whom I will present shortly, and a lot of conversation with myself. After all that, a more festival idea took shape. A panel on the intersections of dress, style, and revolutionary imaginaries, accompanied by an exhibit of a selection of garments from the Cuba Material collection I have been building since 2012, and which you can see in the screen outside of the room. Culottes, berets, liberty caps, leather jackets, fatigues, pussy hats, even hijabs have all been identified with revolutionary movements at different times in history. Counter-revolutionaries, radicals, and governments alike have also resorted to clothes to represent, promote, and normalize their views. Most of the time, however, we would take all these phenomena for granted without problematizing or considering their history, origins, mechanism, or sociological impact. What makes a garment revolutionary? What kind of political legacies and solidarities do clothes represent? This is the kind of questions we will be discussing today. And I want to thank the sponsors who made this event possible. First of all, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, which has given me the best of welcomes during my stay at Brown, which is sadly ending. Also essential has been the support of the Department of Theory and History of Art and Design at the Rhode Island School of Design, and especially Leora Malsleka, the department's head. Finally, the Cogut Institute for the Humanities at Brown also helped with funds. I want to thank them all. And with no further delay, I will introduce the panelists. Okay, I'm going to introduce them in the order that I'm going to present. Regina Ruth is Associate Professor of Hispanic Studies at the College of William and Mary. She's the author of Couture and Consensus, Fashion and Political Culture in Post-Colonial Argentina, and editor of the Latin American Fashion Reader, considered the first book to take a broad look at the influence of Latin American culture on global fashion trends. The Handbook of Fashion Studies, which she edited in collaboration with other experts, presents an overview of the field's history, methodologies, and current debates. She has guest-edited or co-edited special volumes on the topics of eco-fashion, Latin American fashion now, and Brazilian fashion. Simonetta Falasca-Zamponi is professor of sociology at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She studies the political as a site of cultural discourse, cultural identity, and cultural production. Her book, Fascist Spectacle, The Aesthetic of Power in Mussolini's Italy, analyzes the role that symbolic discourse played in the making of the fascist regime and the construction of Mussolini's power. I'll be the third speaker, and my research focuses on the impact of fashion and domestic material culture on regime stability and legitimation during the Cold War. My research on Cuban revolutionary fashion has been published in peer-reviewed journals, which I'm not going to mention, and book chapters. I'm currently working on my manuscript, Dress for the Party, Fashion and Politics in Socialist Cuba. We will be accompanied by the discussants Leora Malsleka, Associate Professor from RIST from the Rhode Island School of Design. She teaches and writes about contemporary art and is particularly interested in how artists from the post-colonies and the Global South are reshaping late modernism by refusing its most cherished assumptions, its hierarchies and its dogmas. Before turning to art history, she worked in corporate law and in the international sales and design sector of the fashion industry. And Richard Snyder, faculty fellow at the Watson Institute and professor of political science at Brown University, is the author, among others, of Passion, Craft, and Method in Comparative Politics, the editor of 3 volumes on the political economy of rural Mexico, and co-editor of a special issue of the journal Studies in Comparative International Development on Dependency and Development in a Globalized World. His articles on comparative politics and the political economy of development have appeared in journals such as British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Politics, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Democracy, and World Politics. Welcome.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Can you hear me? Wonderful. And I just need to tell you that I'm new to blindness and I'm new to facial paralysis. So if I can't get a word out, bear with me. Thank you. Gracias. And I will be respectful of time here. It's so lovely to be here. My talk today is somewhere I can't see. Oh, this is I do see it. The cursor is just a little bit smaller than what I'm used to. Can I do this? Oh dear. I may need your help. Thank you. Es esta. Okay. Presentación. There we are. Brilliant. Right. Brilliant. And then to just click here when the presentation. Oh, awesome. It shows you the next slide from my perspective. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So again, thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm going to talk about reassessing Latin American fashion then and now. Beginning in 2010, during the bicentennial year of independence from Spanish colonialism for several Latin American nations, fashion weeks throughout the region began to assess the symbols of cultural heritage with excitement and new seriousness. In Argentina, the press heralded, oh, I have to see that this works. Does it work? Maybe it works this way. Aha. No, not yet. I'm doing something wrong. Aha, there we go. No? Yes, it is the one. In Argentina, the press heralded retrospectives of national styles, pinpointing their evolution artificially to 1810 for pasado de moda, 1810 a 2010, which can mean a play on words with past fashion, but also out of fashion. The city government of Buenos Aires produced materials explaining that the objective was to take back fashion as historical testimony and demonstrate its critical influence in the formation of Argentine identity. And I think I'm getting it. I am knowing how to work this PowerPoint system that's a little bit different from mine. At the Transnational Fashion Congress, Ixel Moda, 1 year earlier in Cartagena, Colombia, the up-and-coming designers affiliated with, now the late, he died 3 weeks ago, Arturo Tejada Cano's design school, advocated a sustainable bicentennial with upcycled materials, hats in the shapes of Phrygian liberty caps, fashioned with gauze, I am doing something wrong because I might need help one more time because it looks like from my angle it changed. Something happened. Maybe
it's working fine.
It's that one. And then I just click on that. Is that how it works?
Maybe we can just use a little arrow here. Yep.
Brilliant. And so where's the arrow?
The arrow is right.
I see now. Awesome. Awesome.
We're going to lower the lights a little bit too.
This is great. This is great. And that way you can see a little bit better. So you had seen the caps of the Phrygian Liberty caps fashioned with gauze. Here you have military-style jackets with broken chains and top hats with poison warning signs, perhaps a reference to tyranny's past and new foreign invasions. Yes. And sheath dresses featuring colorful screen prints of Simón Bolívar, the 19th century leader whose dreams of a unified revolutionary effort led to South American liberation from Spanish colonial oppression. And here you have the work of, before, Darío Cárdenas, here Juanita Mariño. At first glance, the collection seemed like proposals comprised of dissonant fragments, European in their tailoring and homegrown in outlook. Other garments evoked love, passion, peace, and empowerment, powerful tools with which to emerge from Colombia's drug-fed war. On many levels, these rescued clothes reimagined independence in light of contemporary human rights abuses, economic disparity, the loss of cultural identity, and the ecological crisis at hand. Piecing together fragments of old tires from military vehicles and retired uniforms, these designers had fashioned garments past into something completely different and new. In 2010, Laura Novik, who heads the NGO Raíz Diseño at the forefront of Latin American sustainable design, referenced the need for more Pan-American discussions on the origins of Latin American fashion. And I should say that about, mid-October of this year, 30 Latin American research universities signed an agreement to share research in design education as part of the new Manifiesto de Cartagena, based on Bolívar's Manifiesto de Cartagena, but I think very much different, but declaring their independence from US, European research on sustainable design, thinking that as a bloc they will then have power to respond in light of these national branding initiatives, but also out of the necessity to give future jobs to the designers who they teach. Laura Novik would proclaim, "We cannot brand ourselves if we don't know our own fashion history." Towards a third century of independence, several recent collections have called into question the historical erasure that has made mapping Latin American fashion such a challenge. Unlike a monument that commemorates with imposing permanence, 21st century design proposals are modeling how independence itself constitutes a creative process in progress, both in terms of an active role within its making and as a collective goal. Beyond any fibers, upcycled materials, the idea of a sustainable bicentennial offers an important entry point not only into Colombian fashion, Argentine fashion, but Latin American fashion in order to understand. In spite of its vibrant history, and here we have Painted Dawn, which I'll get into in a few moments, by Augusta Peterle, from Argentina. But in spite of its vibrant history and significant to mass market ranges around the globe, fashion design and history in Latin America has often been overlooked. Analyzing the underpinnings of contemporary collections seems in high order, because some of the events I documented years ago are getting rememorialized. I thought I would acknowledge that revolution and its consequences are a process in much the same way as sartorial pursuits can be, leaving historical legacies and registering diverse responses over time. Briefly, I would like to focus on two shifting styles from the 19th century, from independence, which informed an initial articulation of uniquely national styles. In the early 19th century, and this is based on archival work I have done over the years in the River Plate region, there were several calls for independence that deeply impacted the way people consumed fashion. Under the colonial caste system, Creole descendants of Europeans had been designated inferior social status. In order to imitate their Spanish superiors, they often appropriated subtle details like gold and silver thread, or had special fabrics constructed into outfits. And that's from Arnold Bauer. As rivalries increased between factions, especially in the River Plate region between the Confederates, Federales, and the Unitarians, who wanted a centralized form of government, civil wars were ensuing. Creoles, the Creole elite, moved to Parisian styles that symbolized the legacy of liberty, equality, and fraternity espoused by the French Revolution and advocated a society based on merit rather than inherited privilege. Good. And here you have Juan Camaña, who in 1852 is showing you what popular dress looked like for those who would aspire or support the Confederacy, wearing crimson. While some garments still recalled Spanish tailoring, homegrown manifestations offered popular alternatives, such as the crimson civilian uniform of the Argentine Confederation under Juan Manuel de Rosas, who was in power from 1826 to 1852. According to someone who would become a president of Argentina as Argentina consolidated into a nation state, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, a civilized minority wore French-style clothing and risked persecution by the new regime. In response to Rosas's authoritarian practices, exiled Uruguayan writer Miguel Canet would write in 1839, and I quote, "Fashion is the most flexible side of society, and because of this, it is perfected daily." A change in fashion constituted for Canet a revolutionary change, and he believed it was the historic moment to seize, to change, and as he put it, quote, "to march with the times, with fashion," unquote. Along with independence came shifts in consumption practices. Representations of other empires as superior to the Spanish regime further challenged the status quo. The British invasions in the River Plate region, in Buenos Aires in particular in 1806 and 1807, while unsuccessful, marked a shift in the way inhabitants perceived themselves and their possessions. And I have here, only briefly, won't get into it, but Mariquita Sanchez de Thompson, who represents a sector of that elite of Buenos Aires, who commented on the cultural supremacy of British soldiers during the invasion, commenting on their red-laced boots, their foot-high black feathered hats, plaid sash, bright red jackets, in comparison to the misery that she felt was represented by the Argentine troops. So once the colonial economy had collapsed, foreign imports saturated the marketplace, probably starting in 1820. English businessmen displayed a sartorial process much like diplomatic courting, thus making British etiquette and customs the model for the elite of Buenos Aires. The poncho, and here I have something from Marnie Fogg's Fashion, A Whole History, which includes different parts of the world now in a new expanded fashion canon. We have here a hand-woven garment that recalled semi-nomadic indigenous origins and frontier culture, providing an interesting case for us. British entrepreneurs appropriated the traditional designs, but also supplanted Argentine-made ponchos with prefabricated garments churned out in the mills of Manchester and Birmingham. By 1838, Sir Woodbine Parish, a diplomat and scientist, recalled that the gauchos, the rural pampa dwellers in the interior of the Confederation, of this conglomeration of a River Plate region, dressed almost exclusively in English-made ponchos. As the Creole manufacturers were dismantled, use of the poncho, long a prominent part of the rural wardrobe, had waned. Similarly, if the gaucho's wife had a gown, 10 to 1, it was made in Manchester and Birmingham too. Another case study that is interesting is that of the Peneton. As male leaders arranged political hierarchies after independence, after proclaiming this process, they found public spaces obstructed by groups of women whose political subjectivity they had also overlooked. The British packet routinely reported African Argentine marches with over 400 women in red and white turbans, gold bands, feathers, dresses, sashes, and ribbons, as I quote, marching through the streets in procession, and with the crowds encroaching so much that the soldiers were pushing the crowds back in order to let the women march. At other functions, a ponderous yet not inelegant comb, the peneton, gave women's heads a great deal of importance, described the British packet. Referring to the peneton, which you have here, an example. This is a political caricature by Cesar Hipólito Bacle from his extravagance of 1837. This 1 meter squared tortoiseshell hair comb outsized any Spanish comb, with leg of mutton sleeves, corseted hourglass figures, and crowns as expansive as the pampas. Fashionable women left the confines of their homes with an assertive presence, and the press equated this to a critique of the independence that had been refused to them, the status of citizenship that had been also refused to them. And so, as Argentine as these fashions may have appeared, in reality, they were also very contradictory because they were made in Spanish artisan-based workshops in the 1820s and 1830s. And so to make the peneton, I haven't really thought of how to describe this process, but one had to take, and this would have been an ecological, we can read it very differently now, but African Caribbean tortoises that would, the shells would have been boiled, softened, shaped, overlapped, cut manually, dried, and then polished carefully to reveal original designs, like the one that you saw previously here with Juan Manuel de Rosas. You see a kind of reddish peneton. This comes from the Museo Isaac Fernández Blanco. And it should say, and I believe it does say someone, some of them are just the profile of Rosas. Others will say political slogans like Confederación o Muerte, Confederation or Death, and would have been worn by all classes of women, but we have in the museums what belong to the most elite. Just as the locally, and so peneton combs soon became costly status symbols, with women of the working classes seeking ones made of imitation tortoiseshell. The fashions thrived despite a depressed market, prohibitive tariffs, and vocal critics who disregarded the peneton wearers as prostitutes who had abandoned their families. So I will just give you a little bit of visual register here, where this caricature injures one man in the eye and the other in the groin. So there's something about the unsightly gaze of this very politically assertive woman. And the press initially is describing what a peneton is. Then the peneton becomes a synonym or synonymous with politically active women seeking their citizenship, seeking their independence. This is propaganda that the Rosas government had commissioned in order to help this process of pushing women back into the home, because it was a very threatening stance. And as you can see, there were all of these social codes, norms being changed, altered in the presence of women. And here in this caricature, you have the home wrecker, basically, the woman who has decided that she is leaving home, leaving her family behind. You have lots of popular poetry, lots of articles debating whether or not this would be of any, I don't know, debating, I guess, what this represents, but also how horrible this is and how women just need to stop, get off the streets and go back to their houses. So basically, she is wrecking her house. These are colored images. The originals would have been in black and white, like lithographs, and so people actually got together to paint these. And then to give you an idea of what the fashion illustrations of the time represented as the peineton. Just as the locally woven poncho had been supplanted by machine-made British versions, women dropped the peineton eventually, and with government propaganda and the backlash against their use, for the British bonnet. The British packet lamented the substitution at length for being out of character for emerging nations in a region they also were trying to court entrepreneurially, towards an inclusive fashion studies. And what I will do is give you I guess, a conclusion here, and then some interesting things that I see happening that might be possible venues for research, and maybe as you map history and revolution and style, a way forward. In the early part of the 21st century, one finds the ancient roots of fashion from many world culture regions represented on the catwalks that herald future styles. International luxury brands have appropriated and reinvented the free-fitting and classic shape of the Latin American poncho, or ruana, for example, without ever recognizing that the style predates the arrival of Europeans, its messages and meanings altered through the colonial and post-colonial periods, and that it now serves as a garment evoking a pastiche of cultural identities and utopian possibilities. To engage the poncho is not enough. One has to piece together the fragments to create the icons of cultural identity, and this implies a very time-layered approach. By infusing fashion narratives with cultural memory, it seems appropriate to return to those ideals that began this brief talk. The young Colombian designers who called for a sustainable bicentennial. And I should say, for those of you who aren't Latin Americanists, the bicentennials are continuing. We are on the brink of many to come. And so there is really a lengthy process, and that is something to bear in mind. Had the designers chosen to write about this process rather than using design as their primary tool for reflection, they might have called into question discourses of power and privilege and the unfinished nature of style and revolution. So since this is a story that continues to be told, and perhaps you are mapping this, and this is something that you will also tell and help be a part of, and it's wonderful to think that cross-cultural collaborations and ideas are going to also infuse this new knowledge. I just wanted to leave you with two slices of time from the current moment because I think they're really interesting. And there are two recent interventions. One by and I hopefully can see the cursor, I'm doing pretty well, I think, is Los Chicos del Docena. When you go to Goodwill, if you go to the part of the store or Salvation Army where things are on sale, you know that it's probably not the best stuff. So what they do, they take clothes, basically textile fragments that are sold that no one wants to buy by the dozen, because by the dozen, you can get it for 10 cents. And so it's really the worst of the worst of what is practically unwearable. And what the Chicos del Docena do, docena means dozen, they're buying by the dozen, is take these fragments and rebuild here the poncho. And they are Valparaíso-based in Chile. They're from Argentina. They've now been celebrated on very many runways, but initially this was a very avant-garde approach. And here you have one of its founders, Mechi Martinez, coming back from, no one would call it Goodwill or Salvation Army, it's Señor Amor, or they're different names, but it is true that these are clothing, textile fragments from the United States from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And this, is what is, I guess, giving an urban edge. So the luxury brands appropriate the ponchos without acknowledging their origins. Los chicos del Docena are creating one-of-a-kind pieces from the very real fragments of fashion's past and then reselling it. They're upcycling. And not only that, when they sell it back to the United States, it becomes this really interesting dynamic of resistance. The other, and here, collective design is really much a part of this process because Mechi Martinez and María Breccia, who started Los Chicos del Docena, have been invited by many different places to just bring together people with sewing machines and textile fragments and sort through it and make something interesting happen. I will just show you that the last Salvation Army that I had attended, Señor Amor runway, was in 2011, and it's very hard to take clothing that seems haunted. And there's a big debate and, a new generation that doesn't see this. So how do you, take these fragments and build something and make something happen? So that is very much a part of the dialogue and an interesting thing, I think, that would merit further study. And then the one that I bring, the second one, is the Moda Itinerante, and a traveling exhibit that just began this last mid-October. And it commemorates independence of Colombia. Colombia declared independence in 1810, but it wasn't until 1819 that Simón Bolívar liberated the rest in the Batalla de Huacán from the the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada. And I am going to again find the cursor. I should have done something differently. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I see it. I see it. I see it. Oh no. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. This is where life can be really challenging sometimes, but 1819. So this exhibit was made by the Colombian Ministry of Culture. You have here the hashtag more Colombian than ever, más colombiano que nunca. You have the Minister of Culture dressed in orange, Carmen Vázquez, because she's also representing the new orange economy that Colombia has announced, which will give funding to anyone who has cultural heritage concerns and an idea, design concepts in place to help appreciate the work of artisans and also think of how to repair society. And so you saw here, comprender el pasado para solucionar problemas del presente, proyectarnos como una gran nación. In English, it would be something like to understand the past, to offer solutions to our problems in the present, is to project ourselves as a great nation. And I will just end here with María Luisa Ortiz. She's one of the most interesting, there's several interesting designers, but contemporary Colombian designers who, for this bicentennial of 1819-2019, came up with this recycled ensemble. It's a jacket, it's flowy pants, and it has the words repair the heart, to heal. And I will just end with this context that the invited country was Brazil this year for the Latin American Fashion Congress. that has been in place since 2008. And so Ronaldo Fraga, a very celebrated designer, brought his cataloged runway, museum cataloged runway collection called Paz y Guerra, Guerra y Paz, War and Peace, layering what once spoke to Brazilian dictatorship, but now spoke to a new process ahead for Colombia. And I will just end with a statement that I thought was pretty profound that he made, which was, "We have more items for war than peace." And so as he reflected with recycled materials to make his collection on war and peace, he was also thinking through quite a lot and reassessing what fashion can maybe mean. So I leave it there, and thank you. And I hope that we will get to talk afterwards. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And yeah, there we go. I hope I'm being a good citizen by leaving my PowerPoint where the next person, Simonetta, will have better luck than I. If you're interested in finding more about Ixel Moda, please look them up on the website. It's about 10,000 people gathering each year. All right, Simonetta, thank you, thank you.
The war revolution evokes images of tumult, movement, and change. It suggests a certain sense of ebullience shared by the participants, what Durkheim called a collective effervescence, an uncontainable joy that spills over, an irrepressible desire for oversized emotions. To Durkheim, who was certainly not a revolutionary, effervescence explains so many of what he called the sublime or savage moments in the French Revolution, when, and I quote from him, "we see the most mediocre or harmless bourgeois transformed by the general exaltation into a hero or an executioner," end of quote. Even for the socially conservative Durkheim, revolutions had an inherently positive force due to their power of bringing about renewal. With all their contradictory moments of savagery and sublimity, revolutions fundamentally inspired people, including those least inclined to change. If violence generally marks the exceptional character of the particular times we call revolutionary, the inspiring appeal of revolution also transpires in the phase that sometimes accompanies and sometimes follows the violence. That's when people's energies are channeled into festive moods that still convey the energy of the events, but convert that energy into colorful and high-spirited celebrations. The sociologist Henri Lefebvre, citing the experiment of the 1871 Paris Commune, even theorized the revolution as festival. In his mind, the students' contestations of May 1968 ideally reconnected with the iconic episode of the Commune and constituted a representative example of collective social change. Why am I referencing the sublime moments and festive character of revolutions? Because I believe that Italian fascism constitutes an example of quite the opposite. What I'm trying to say is that if fascism were a revolution, it was one of the most colorless and dull. Let's just focus on the original episode of the March on Rome that paved the way to fascism's eventual takeover of power in 1922. Who participated in the event? We see groups of men, many of them not especially young, decorated veterans of the First World War, all wearing black shirts and mostly dark pants. Hardly a colorful uniform. It's difficult to sense any effervescence coming out of these images, either in terms of the protagonists or in regard to popular participation and enthusiasm. Now, this one, you probably can guess, It's a modern version of the fascist uniforms. These are nostalgic fascists. And even them, they're even dullest than the original fascists. Anyway, I will go back because I hate to look at that picture. But even if we consider my opinion as based on an impression, we know that the violence itself was more of a threat than a reality during the March on Rome. There were no actual fights, no direct confrontations, and practically no dead. But the fact I wish to draw attention to here is, however, that Mussolini never gave up calling fascism a revolution. Indeed, he even called it a bloody revolution, and he specifically indicated in the March on Rome the foundational revolutionary act of fascism. So the question is, why did he always insist that the march was an insurrection, and a violent one at that? In part, Mussolini reclaimed a revolutionary identity because a revolution emphasized the novelty of his movement and the distance between him and the old governmental class. Not by chance, he referred to fascism as young. Youth symbolically signified energy and dynamism. It was a metaphor for action and change. The importance of symbolism was one not lost on Mussolini. In contrast, his attachment to the trope of revolution and his embrace of youth were part and parcel of a more comprehensive approach to modern political rule, an approach that he developed over time and that was based on the need to foster new symbols, myths, and traditions. These new symbols were supposed to convey the principles of the fascist movement, while also exciting popular participation. And even more importantly, Mussolini considered symbols and rituals as elements through which fascism could affect what he called the Italians' style. In practice, turning Italians into new men. In his newly minted vocabulary, new men were citizen soldiers whose disciplined behavior created a beautiful order, both visually and in terms of actions. These new men would engage in glorious enterprises expected to bring grandeur and prestige to the country. War, which is what all this came down to in the end, depended on a disciplined body of people, an orderly whole that also appeared aesthetically beautiful. Mussolini believed that style was a visible sign of internal characteristics. And in a peculiar logical reasoning, he also seemed to think that a change in style could produce a transformation in character. Thus, his regime dedicated utmost attention to the formal aspects of the Italians' way of living. And in the 1930s, it even initiated a so-called reform of customs. This reform targeted people's modes of behavior and ways of dressing as the most noticeable signs of a person's attitude. Within this context, because the black shirt had originally signified fascism's revolutionary spirit and audacity, it came to be regulated by norms that dictated its use with precision. If, in Mussolini's view, external aspects reflected inner features, dressing was certainly a most visible practice in a person's daily routine and needed to be confronted. Now, when we look at the rules governing the black shirt, we realize the idiosyncratic nature of the regime's intervention on clothing. The instructions for the black shirt imposed by the party functionaries apply to the use of uniforms during official events and celebrations that did not address everyday habits. Of course, critical messages related to fashion, and especially directed to those considered bourgeois, decadent lifestyles, circulated during the regime. But the rhetoric did not convert into specific guidelines about alternative ways of dressing. Compared to other authoritarian governments that were also pursuing totalitarian aims, such as the Soviet Union and China, the the fascist regime made no major effort to introduce standardized attires. This might be one of the contradictions fascism suffered, and we don't know if it might have been resolved over time had the regime not fallen in 1943. But if it is true that orders and injunctions did not specifically apply to regular clothing in day-to-day activities, it is also true that all Italians from different age and social groups were subjected to rules by the mere fact that most of them were enlisted in multiple fascist organizations. There were fascist associations of any kind, from schools, public employees, railroad and postal services, professionals and artists, agricultural, commercial, and industrial businesses. And then there was the National Institute of Fascist Culture, youth and women's organizations, and leisure time associations. All of these continuously assembled their members for activities and events that required following formal rules, including those applying to wearing a uniform. The black shirt, in particular, was at the forefront of the regime's intervention. We actually don't know the exact origins of the black shirt and how it entered the fascist horizon. Be as it may, in the early stages of Mussolini's movement, members of the squads that engaged in violent attacks against socialist and leftist organizations wore black shirts, and metonymically came to be called black shirts. After their participation in the March on Rome, when Mussolini became prime minister, the black shirts were dismantled and replaced with a special corps. The black shirt, however, remained a fascist outfit because it was considered a reminder of the movement's historical exordium. Thus, the black shirt constituted the basic piece of party members' uniforms and remained a constant of fascist attire spanning more than 20 years of variations. The basic elements of the official fascist outfit were adopted in 1926. They included a fez, which is what this guy with the flag is wearing, a black shirt, black tie, black pants, and a black belt. So this is probably the beginning. As you can see, there is also a skull that, that was very evident what they were trying to do. All the participants in the numerous fascist organizations wore the black shirt. Here we see a women's group with a similar shirt, but with a different style. In November 1934, even infants and children up to 80 years old were organized under the umbrella name of Sons and Daughters of the She-Wolf and outfitted in miniature black shirts. During the 1920s, use of the black shirt did not follow precise rules. Even Mussolini wore it on random occasions. However, already by then, he had begun to claim that the black shirt could only be worn in particular circumstances and not every day. In September 1924, for example, he told Parliament that he would order the arrest of those who wore the shirt improperly. A year later, he stated to the Fascist Congress, and I quote, "The black shirt is not the everyday shirt, and is not a uniform either. It is a combat outfit and can only be worn by those who harbor a pure soul in their heart." End of quote. Now, whatever having a pure soul in one's heart means, Mussolini was following the practice of making the shirt sacred by isolating its use and setting it apart from the everyday. The shirt was supposed to be worn on ritual occasions that were separate from profane, mundane activities. As time went on and the regime extended its control over Italians' life, regulations multiplied, including those for the black shirt. In 1931, the party issued 10 fascist commandments. One of them stated, and I quote, "He who is not ready to sacrifice body and soul to Italy and to serve Mussolini without question is unworthy of wearing the black shirt symbol of fascism, end of quote. Rigid orders also instructed all fascist associations about the right accessories when dressing in a black shirt. Children, youth, and women's groups had their own particular variations in outfit, because ultimately each group occupied a place in the whole. And here we see 3 children of different age, and each one has a different outfit. The sense of discipline and order emanating from their uniforms produced an aesthetic effect that reflected fascist inner qualities, or at least that's what the party seemed to be expecting. So here we see a bunch of little kids, again, the sons of the she-wolf. And here again, so always in groups because they were participating in activities as a group. And here you see even the more military kind of sense of being all together with somebody even directing them, even if it was just another kid. Uniforms provided a counterexample to individualism and its selfish mentality. Indeed, failure to wear the fascist outfit revealed one's bourgeois tendencies. And here we see a poster that, in fact, is supposed to criticize or make fun of the bourgeois. Again, a very constructed figure, who's wearing top hats going around in Italy in the 1920s and 30s. So it's a very, exaggerated critique that was just for propaganda purposes. Even if the regime never imposed an overall sartorial remake, it believed it could check on its citizens' loyalty and sense of obedience by peppering them with impositions that tested their fascist faith. This means you could not estrange yourself from the reality imposed by the regime. In contrast, your fascist beliefs were always under scrutiny. Men were probably on call more than women. After all, they were the ones who fought, the soldiers. And fascism was all oriented towards building a war-ready citizenry fit for combat. But everybody was actually involved in the effort to make Italy great in order to build an imperial power, even if women were not actively in the army. Incidentally, in 1932, the color of the shirt for women's groups changed from black to white. We don't know the reasons for the change, but it is somewhat symptomatic of the identity fascism envisaged for Italy, a manly world of a homogeneous, virile army of ready-to-fight soldiers. Fascism wanted to be able to command the Italians' private life and reaffirm the priority of the state. People were supposed to be public servants in pursuit of fascism's ends, not private citizens fulfilling their own good. Ultimately, the black shirt ensured that all Italians fit into fascism's ideal of a harmonious whole supervised by Mussolini. Because wearing the black shirt was a duty and not a choice, it showed obedience and allegiance to the superior power of Mussolini, fascism, and the regime. I'm done.
Last year, after the Parklands High School massacre, survivor Emma Gonzalez appeared on a stage of the March for Our Life in Washington, D.C., clad in torn jeans and a green bomber jacket. Later, Republican Congressperson Steve King tweeted, "This is how you look when you claim Cuban heritage, yet don't speak Spanish, and ignore the fact that your ancestors fled the island when the dictatorship turned Cuba into a prison camp after removing all weapons from its citizens, hence their right to self-defense." End quote. Numerous Cuban Americans also commented on social media That wearing a green military jacket with a Cuban flag patch was a clear allusion to the Castro regime, and that revealed González's political loyalties, meaning leftism. Attacks turned so bitter that Representative Ileana Ros-Lehtinen tweeted that José González, Emma's father, had contacted her to explain that his daughter was proud of her dad and abuela's Cuban heritage, and in no way was wearing such clothes a sign of support for the Castro dictatorship. End of quote. This taps into the larger question of the sartorial symbols that identify the Cuban Revolution, and into the even broader question of the relationship between sartorial and revolutionary imaginaries. In the following minutes, I will outline 5 different logics that illustrate this relationship in the context of the Cuban Revolution, including during the periods of upheaval, triumph, consolidation, and state power. Soon after, a group of 82 men commanded by Fidel Castro arrived in the eastern coast of Cuba to rise in arms against Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship. The rather diverse revolutionary movement began to be increasingly linked to the single identity of the olive drab-clad bearded guerrillas. It may have all begun with Herbert Matthews, a New York Times journalist who in 1957 penned the first reportage on Fidel Castro and his movement published in a U.S. mainstream media. Matthews presented Castro as a flaming symbol of the anti-Batista movement, describing him as a, quote, a powerful 6-footer, olive-skinned, full-faced, with a straggly beard. He was dressed in an olive gray fatigue uniform and carried a rifle with a telescopic sight, of which he was very proud. End of quote. Matthews' piece was followed by a photo reportage on Fidel Castro's guerrilla published that same year in Life magazine, and a CBS documentary titled Rebels of the Sierra Maestra, the story of Cuba's jungle fighters. However, by the time these pieces of journalism appeared, the guerrilla had yet to become a significant force, both numerically and militarily. The media not only anticipated, but also constructed the guerrilla myth, as historians have noted. And this was in part based on the particular symbolism of their sartorial identity. Domestic propaganda campaigns also gave disproportionate visibility, of course underground campaigns, to the Sierra Maestra rebels. Produced by the July 26 movement, which was Castro's political organization, the cartoon series, for instance, Julito 26, which in Spanish means Little July 26, portrays the homonymous character as a guerrilla. Little July is depicted wearing a fatigue uniform, a black beret, and a beard. Likewise, the flyer of the December 1958 campaign 03C, launched shortly before the revolutionary victory, encouraged Cubans in the cities not to attend to the movies, go shopping, or party at nightclubs during Christmas. The illustrations depict fatigue-clad rebels risking their lives for Cuba's freedom, poignantly contrasted with frivolous upper-middle-class Christmas activities. Each of these cases underscore the role the sartorial identity of the guerrilla played in giving visibility to the Cuban Revolution during the period of revolutionary upheaval, both domestically and abroad. This would be the first element I want to stress on the relationship between revolution and style. Also important to note, but by identifying the revolution with the young bearded guerrilla fighters in the Sierra Maestra, the representation constructed played down the significance of other anti-Batista groups, including the underground movement and the anonymous, invisible role women play sewing guerrilla uniforms and delivering them, along with weapons and funds, to the Sierra Maestra. When Batista finally escaped on the New Year's Eve 1958, Castro marched toward Havana in what is known as a caravan of liberty. Stopping in Camagüey and Santa Clara, these are two central provinces, he expressed his desire that members of the diverse revolutionary organizations wore olive drab uniforms without the arm bracelets that identify their groups, explaining they all belong to a single revolutionary movement. This would be the second element to stress. The role olive green uniforms played in portraying a single, unified revolutionary movement immediately following the revolutionary victory. A moment in which diverse actors aspire to assert their own visibility and thus capitalize power. This strategy also worked toward consolidating the myth that identified the guerrilla with the revolutionary vanguard, once more obliterating the urban underground movement. During the vacuum of power that followed Batista's departure, the widespread visibility of olive green fatigue uniforms invisibilized other revolutionary organizations and co-opted their political capital in favor of Castro's leadership. After the revolution muted into state power, the former guerrilla leaders, now state officials, remain attached to their guerrilla identities. Having been told to change clothes before swearing in as prime minister, in order not to resemble the stereotypical Latin American military dictator, Castro declared, quote, "Ah, no, this uniform and this beard represent the rebelliousness of the Sierra Maestra and our revolution, and I absolutely won't get rid of them. Go find another prime minister." End of quote. He also ignored, Castro, the advice of the U.S. public relations firm the Cuban government hired prior to his visit to New York in April 1959. He was right, after all. His iconoclastic identity made headlines, even inspiring Brooklyn school children to imitate him, wearing fake beards and olive drab uniforms. This would be the third feature that characterizes the relationship between revolution and style in the Cuban case: the transferability of meanings from clothes to wearers. That is, from fatigue uniforms previously associated with the revolution to government leaders, to citizens, and to state institutions and the government itself. This is a postcard printed by the Cuban government. By remaining attached to old olive drab identities, guerrilla leaders and the state institutions they represented could claim an intrinsic revolutionary ethos. The transferability of meanings from clothes to institutions allowed the leadership to call the Council of Ministers, for instance, revolutionary government, or even the revolution, a label that Castro also applied to himself. Yet this was also valid for individuals who pretended to adopt a brand new guerrilla identity by just stepping into new clothes, not necessarily out of actual revolutionary steel. Referring to the political commissar of the School of Architecture, architect Mario Coyula would describe him as, quote, "a grotesque character who walked around campus dressed up in an olive green uniform with a Makarov revolver in his belt, which he carried even though he had never been an insurrectionary," end of quote. The display of the sartorial identity of the guerrilla in the post-revolutionary present in some, particularly the use of olive green uniforms, served to reenact the idea of the revolution, which could then be presented as a contemporary event oriented toward the pursuit of both national sovereignty and economic progress. By infusing a revolutionary ethos into post-revolutionary society, olive green uniforms also helped to demarcate the revolutionary present from the pre-revolutionary past, the before and after, and to create and identify political loyalties within the revolutionary present, who was inside and who was outside. This idea, in turn, was at the base of processes of social engineering. within newly created institutions such as the militias, as well as the renovated army and the whole school system, all of them oriented towards transforming identities based in part on the exposure to the sartorial style and practices of the guerrilla. The new sartorial norms may have helped as well to foster the radicalization of individuals in favor of the regime, its institutions, and values, by enforcing practices of socialization that collided with other institutions, such as the church, for instance. The following testimony illustrates the estrangement from the Catholic Church a parishioner endured in the early 60s when, compelled by the demands of a revolutionary life, work, study, political meetings, she went to Mass clad in the militia uniform. I'm quoting from her. I went to communion as I usually did. I went, I confessed, I went to take communion, and when the priest stopped in front of me to give me the host, he did not give it to me. I thought, well, maybe he made a mistake. That is what I thought. He skipped me and made a mistake. But he passed by me again and again. He did not give me the host. The third time, I grabbed him by the arm, which is something you are not supposed to do because, you know, it is sacrilege to do that. To talk there in front of the host, you can't do that. I stopped him and I told him, Father, you did not give me the host. And he said, no, you are in mortal sin. And I said, me? Who confessed? Actually, I didn't think anything of it. I just told him, I confessed. He said, yes, but look at what you are wearing. And then I looked at myself, and that was when I erupted. I said to him, what? Am I in mortal sin because of this, the militia uniform? And that's when I smacked the ciborium and all the hosts scattered. Well, they rolled throughout the hall with the ciborium on the floor. End of quote. With time, and this will be my fourth observation, olive green became a symbol, now disassociated from clothes. A metonymical association distilled and separated the color from the garment, turning it into a symbol of both Castro and the Cuban regime, as this school drawing illustrates. This explains why, to convey political continuity, the newly appointed Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, declared that the Cuban Revolution continued to be olive green. This also explains the fierce criticism that last year targeted Emma González's sartorial choices. For Cuban exiles, olive drab is the symbol of the regime they despise. Yet the Cuban public sphere cannot and should not be transposed to Washington, D.C., nor for that sake to Florida. On the stage of the March for Our Life, Emma González's olive green bomber jacket, covered with patches and pins, represented meanings actually opposed to what the Cuban regime stands for: tolerance, diversity, and participation in the res publica.
Thank you so much, all of you. Wonderful papers, just really fascinating and evocative and interesting in ways. I'm still gathering my thoughts about them, and I guess, and as you were talking, I was trying to find continuities and sort of threads between them. And I think one of the things that struck me was the way all of you talked about processions of various kinds. So you were talking about the March on Rome, about the group of Afro-Argentinian women who are marching in procession. And then, María, I believe you also were at the end talking about Caravan of Liberty. And so I guess from a visual point of view, I was really interested in the way that the march visually puts these clothes in motion. It creates a certain kind of frontal view of them, because I mean, if one thinks about clothing, obviously it's three-dimensional and it might often be photographed frontally, but not always. But it also creates a kind of perspective. I mean, there's a mass of people, so everything is kind of multiplied. And then there's the kind of, forward advance. And and I'm just, and I'm completely ignorant about this, but I'm wondering to the extent to which that kind of visual hieroglyphics of the forward march is important or not in the way that this clothing has been, and then sort of moving on from that, oftentimes one finds the walking figure isolated, so that sometimes it's imagery of kind of the procession, but then sometimes it's just the kind of single figure striding. And so that was just something that I was curious about. Obviously marches are central to revolution, and have been, as you talked about festivals and those kinds of things, and it has that really, really long history. But I guess I was just curious. Have thoughts about that?
But yes, in the Cuban case, Caravan of Liberty was a huge party. It was an event of enormous proportions, and definitely the triumph of the Cuban Revolution was really well received by, I would say, most of the island, the population in the island. So it lasted from January 1st or 2nd until January 8th when Fidel Castro arrived in Havana. This is a route that it can be done in one day, but I mean, everybody wanted to see him, touch the heroes, and also that gave Fidel Castro a lot of visibility in the media and in the Cuban public sphere, and led him to map the public opinion, how things were developing in the days in which there was a vacuum of power. So everybody revealed their ambitions, and he could get a diagnosis of the political map in Cuba. So when he arrived in Havana, his march had been covered by the press. He arrived like a real, he actually was a hero when he arrived in Havana. The day he arrived was actually the day the three kings are celebrated in the Catholic tradition. So that added another layer of meaning to his arrival. So that was
I'm claiming it wasn't, right, a revolution in the sense. If you notice the two pictures, one photo Mussolini is wearing a black shirt, in the other one he was wearing. But that should tell you that in fact he didn't even participate in Rome by train. And the interesting thing is not that he arrived wearing the black shirt. He arrived in regular clothing and then went to see the king, who was hours to become the new. And he wore the black shirt and told the king, "I'm sorry, I come, dressed in a way that I'm not supposed to come and talk to the king, but I come from the battle." So it was a whole completely, which is interesting. And again, so it's not like people were waiting for the march. There was no popular appeal for sure. So it's all more at the level of he already knew about how to really deal with what happens these days. In the modern era.
Very different context, and perhaps what is different about, I guess, with the 19th century is that you have very few registers of dress, and you have more description from the fashion press or journalism. And often in the context of the River Plate region, you had men masquerading as women because this assertive figure was such a debate. And you also had a great deal of censorship, and there was very little censorship of fashion, because everyone assumed it was a very frivolous thing to write about. But in that dynamic of what you are saying about the caravans of liberty, and there are so many, really the descriptions abound of women who are asserting their rights in many different ways. And there is suspicion always in the press that actually women are not writing about this, men are, or are women writing. And so there's a very different context, a professionalization of the woman author, but also for very real reasons, I think, public opinion being just, I guess, coming out through where are women in this? They walk alone, or are they walking as with others? But very different, and yet what an interesting way to bring some of these ideas of style and revolution together.
Well, I was just add that together a little bit. It's just and then I'll obviously, but just to it's so interesting the contrast between them, between the different contexts, because, and also then the gender issues that play out, because on the one hand, sometimes one associates the march itself with the claiming of the land in revolutionary context, but then in another way, often, Regina, when you were talking about the censorship, oftentimes the march itself is censored, so that there's a way in which, like I'm sure in Cuba, weren't subsequent marches largely censored, so that then, because the march is a central kind of performative element of a democracy, and the right to gather and march is then often not available anymore, so the march becomes this kind of founding moment. But particularly in the instance of women, I was just so struck, when Regina mentioned the Women's March, because, in many contexts in the last decade or so, in parts of Southern Africa, women have marched, naked, often, particularly as a form of protest. And so the gender dynamics then of women marching, particularly if they're naked, versus men marching, are just really, really striking, and yet, just amazing, the kind of variability among the context. Yeah.
Castro, when the Caravan of Liberty. Okay. In the Cuban case, when women, now that you mentioned women, tried to reach Castro and give him like tokens of their support or for the Cuban Revolution. So some of them put pins on his clothes or put things in his pockets. So yeah, I just want to add that.
Well, I'm sort of an outsider here in a number of ways as a political scientist. Very sympathetic to fashion and style. You should be able to tell from my clothes. And, common threads, there's some I thought I wanted to emphasize. Regina, I thought you gave a wonderful example of what would be called cultural appropriation with the poncho, the use of the poncho and the sort of erasure or forgetting of its origins in indigenous culture. And then this excellent example of reverse cultural appropriation with the Docena group, which is taking discarded third, secondhand, whatever clothes from the United States and then knitting them back together and selling them back. And I thought that was quite interesting. And both Simonetta and María have interesting angles on what we political scientists call political regime dynamics. And, the Mussolini regime initially was less intrusive on the daily lives of people, and therefore less of a totalitarian regime in some sense. And you can sort of track the transformation of the regime to becoming, more intrusive, as you say, with the codification of rules about wearing the black shirt or not, et cetera. So I think that's an interesting indicator, to use that language. Clothes, fashion may be an interesting, underutilized, undervalued indicator of political transformation. That's the point of the panel, really, and of political regimes. What kind of what is democracy? What kind of clothes do Democrats wear? What kind of clothes do just regular authoritarian but not totalitarian rulers, Franco as opposed to Hitler? It's interesting to ponder that. Having said that, I want to play devil's advocate for a second and push things in a slightly different direction. So, Maria, one of the archives that you're drawing on for your photographs, it's the Ramiro Fernandez collection of Cuban ephemera. And I thought for a second, political scientists don't focus much on style, partly because they might say, well, it's ephemera. If I want to understand revolution, I'm going to focus on class relations. I'm going to focus maybe on the material foundations for organizing a revolutionary force, maybe the topography and whether there's rough terrain, maybe transnational pressures to militarize or support or lack of support from superpower patrons, charisma of leaders. The last thing I'm going to take seriously and want to focus on is clothes. It's epiphenomenal, it's ephemera, it's fleeting, it's not even skin deep. So I just wonder how you all would respond to that take on fashion, style, and clothes.
Say that is why a lot of political analysis are incomplete. Because fashion actually, or I'm using a very wide definition of what fashion is. We can call it dress or clothes or it's very dated. Actually, it's an expression of identities, and in the case of revolution, you were talking about classes and how do you express or convey classes. There is no way better probably to identify immediately, probably wrongly, but at least it's a way to communicate not only class, but it's a means of communication, it's a means of expression of identities, including class identities. So I think that political scientists should include dress in their analysis more often.
Well, I think it's also an issue of what kind of question you want to ask, right? Or what answer you're looking for. One issue about how revolutions even happen, right? What are the elements? What are the political forces at play? There's also, once they happen, how do they evolve, right? How do they perform? How do they reach their goals? Or what are their goals? Are they changing? And one of probably other problems are revolutions about badly. I mean, we all know that most of them, don't go in the direction that people thought they would. But there is also the issue of the people on the ground, right? I mean, besides the big agonists, not just individuals, but that put in motion all these different probably also hold on to power. But what about the people? Because often the issue is also why do the regimes last, right? And we need what people think, or why don't they do anything if they think differently? But what is the sentiment or the beliefs of the people? From that point of view, we need to look at aspects, since in most not express themselves, right? Normally in writing or answer ask. So you have to look at other elements that can give some indication. Challenging, it might be, but I think that, as we know, what kind of material one uses.
Because of the fact, I'm sorry, Regina.
Oh, this is great.
That
Oh, this is
people won't expect you to won't expect to see politics embedded in clothes or communicated to clothes. It's an indirect way to see meaning more easily, or that people are afraid to express in other ways, more open. So it's like an indirect way to get meanings that you won't be able to know through other means. And also not only to, in my view, it helps not only to understand the historical reality of each of the revolutions, but also to understand the very own revolution itself. For instance, how revolutionary a revolution is, how effective are the changes that the revolutionary authorities propose in terms of codes of dress, etc.
I would add, and it's so interesting because we're really having a multidisciplinary discussion through dress and fashion style revolution. I'm really struck, Simonetta, what you said about how revolutions happen and how they change. Because I think that that is the spirit of some of these ways of communicating, and that perhaps the connection is, and I would say we all need each other in some ways, because those patterns are going to get established and be double checked, and scholarly knowledge will grow out of that and constantly changes based on new discoveries. And I'll give you an example. When I was in the archives in the 1990s in Buenos Aires, it was very lovely that I went every day for 2 years, because I eventually befriended the librarians who let me go back into the stacks, because you couldn't do that, and then said, oh, and then there's this. And sometimes we don't realize that our current work has also regime changes, and that a museum might not have things cataloged. We might not have all that information. And that intellectual humility that we bring in our disciplines and then foster with these connections can be really important and insightful. So I just wanted to add that. And I'm very intrigued by the idea of cultural appropriation, and I don't really know what to do with all of that. I'll leave some of this to all of you. But it is a form of resistance, I think, selling back what many artists, designers, and consumers don't want. And to do so with upcycling that goes into the hundreds and thousands of dollars and goes into markets that don't even realize. In Cuba, for instance, I heard recently of Clandestina, which takes these abandoned Cuban tourist T-shirts. People are just discarding because they don't want to take it back home. They'd rather take a Cuban T-shirt. And the design team basically rescues these T-shirts, refurbishes them, upcycles them, stamps them, and then resells them to the Canadian tourist. So that's kind of what can happen to.
I was actually going to jump in as well with, I think as the only art historian perhaps on this panel, I should address the kind of hierarchical and misleading term ephemera, which is really a museum art historical category that refers to things that are deemed less significant or less important, or part of visual culture or material culture rather than part of art history. So essentially, you know, a painting or a print is just as ephemeral as a postcard or a greeting card, but it's really a derogatory category. In fact, I would actually suggest that that so-called ephemera is much less ephemeral than studying something like charisma. And that, in fact, it's the opposite dynamic in play, which is that political scientists, like most academics, feel more comfortable with actually studying immaterial concepts rather than, you know, the nitty-gritty of material things. I mean, I think the bias against studying clothing and fashion really, you know, reflects ingrained hierarchies between the conceptual and the play out, you know, and you know, that is kind of what's at play. But in fact, you know, there are more material things to look at and think about. And so I think the irony of it actually being labeled ephemeral when it's in fact very material is really something that ponder. But also, so much of your work, all of your work, I thought was so respectful to items of visual culture that are often thrown out. I mean, the children's drawing that you showed was just beautiful, and then the contemporary photographs, Simonetta, that you showed as well. I mean, and you had, well, Regina. I mean, I was so struck by the kind of democratic, egalitarian gaze in which you're taking all of this different material seriously, because I think sometimes in the museum or art historical context, there's a real hierarchy that actually blinds people to see on the same playing field. Not being an art historical context.
Okay, so if you have any questions. And in a way, it's connected with charisma, because the way these leaders constructed their persona, it was built on the way they were choosing these clothes and the way they were articulating their charisma through fashion. So I think in a way it's connected. And looking at Fidel Castro, looking at Mussolini, they were making a statement by choosing these specific outfits. And for Fidel Castro, it was a way also to communicate his platform, his political platform. I'm going to be always a soldier, I'm going to be always a soldier of the revolution. This is my message. And actually, it replicated in Latin America, because Chavez in Venezuela was also wearing the uniform. So it was a political statement. And it was loaded with so many layers that as a politician, we can always deconstruct too. So I think it's connected to the charisma. Connected.
Significance of hair that can be part of fashion, but can be its own representation. I mean, the example of Fidel's beard, the example of elaborate hairstyles and combs. And hair is still very much a site of conflict and self-expression and, anti-establishmentarianism, whatever the word is, that I think this of its own mention. And it's deeply political to come to the point about political science. And I think studying hair and hair style is a very important element.
And yes, tells you how feminine or masculine the social movement can. In one case, it was very masculine, and the beard is a symbol. In the Argentinian case, it's a feminine.
A lot of contemporary artists have made some really interesting out of hair, honing in on that. I'm thinking particularly of as a way to think about the people who disappeared, because that the delicacy of the hair as a trace, but then also the labor goes into working with it. So there's actually really some really interesting art where artists have kind of honed in on that materiality of it. And
I have a question. So Latin America is obviously a region of deep and protracted economic inequality. So what is the role, or is there any risk in high fashion being seen as maybe sensationalizing or diminishing the role or the socioeconomic status of the lower classes in Latin America, especially in like high fashion, like fashion show context?
What a great question. It's a challenging question to answer as well, because as you know, and as you have said in your question, Latin America is a very diverse and rich region, and often it is it is a projection from outside where you don't realize you're a Latin Americanist until my dissertation director or advisor, Tulio Alperin Dogui, was saying he came from Argentina to Berkeley and then realized it was a projection from outside. But what I can tell you is this, is that, yes, there are definite pushes in commerce departments, in culture departments, in governments, many governments in the region, because fashion is big business. It also, with fashion weeks, means tourism. People actually travel from all over within a country and sometimes regionally to partake in collective design practices, but also knowledge about what is new and noteworthy. At the same time, you do have a thriving system of design education that often gets overlooked, that isn't well funded. And you have designers who, like the Chicos de Lucena, come from very little and then all of a sudden, years later, are heralded as the designers of the moment and therefore have much more lucrative careers. And but the heart of your question, which is about inequity, is one very much at the forefront of places like Ixal Moda and with the design educators who signed that accord in October of this year, in part because just of the internal displacements within Colombia is 6 million people. I think it's the second largest group after Syria. The UN was also giving $1 million for fashion industry initiatives to help especially artisans coming from Venezuela, Venezuelan refugees, in order so that people have jobs, but also to help certain work thrive because it's being lost. And so part of that recovery process is the work of the artisan, is thinking through some real dire needs. And so it may be twofold. It may be that the answer to your question is that, yes, it is about an industry that is greedy, that is not sustainable. And at the same time, you have design educators who know that in order to sustain any future and a future for Latin American design, you have to band together and think through what it's going to take in order to address those inequities. It's a very challenging thing, and one I think that people do grapple with. I heard, just give you an example, just one example, the head of H&M was addressing Ixel Moda, the same designers, team and educators, and everybody knew that that design model is not going to be around and would not mean the future of humanity on the planet. And so the basic consensus, a scholarly consensus, was that we will choose our science fiction. And so it may not be that one. It could be something with heart that thinks of people and works with people and design in new ways.
I just want to add that an answer to your question either, but some of these projects in Latin America are ready make and investing that profit into community projects and helping disadvantaged communities. In Cuba, for instance, there is, and this is not clandestine, by the way, hairdresser project that took a street, a back street, and they call it the back street of dressers, and they have, I mean, this is a very impoverished neighborhood. And water, running water to houses, and yeah, so that might be also a way to help to But I think it's also important if you can make your message heard in wider the exposure that these platforms give to concerns that are more local or Latin Americans are also important. Why not?
Questions? Sorry.
Yeah.
I have
Anything
two
else?
questions.
You have questions. Okay.
I just want to have one question for you, Simonetta, about the fascist archive. There are not archive. For instance, you said that there is no way to know Black chair, and what happened with the fascist archives?
Well, it's not because
First, you can go on from
Yes.
there exist.
Yes, yes.
And and I was curious about the Latin American fashion. I mean, the Argentinian nationalist fashion that they don't use the colors as a means of expression. Colors of the flag, or
And you're talking about the 19th century.
yeah, the independence
Yes.
movement. Because in Cuba, women wore stripes of fabric with the colors of the Cuban flag.
Yes, and for reasons of time, I couldn't get
Okay.
into that. But I would tell you that, the Argentine Confederation, the Federalist movement, which is trying to decentralize government and kind of come up with, I guess, a loosely Confederate idea of Argentina, did adopt crimson. It did become law, and people did adopt ribbons, which were considered luxurious. And then the colors of the opposition, the Unitarians who wanted a centralized form of government in Buenos Aires, wore light blue, which were the colors of independence, the flag that is still Argentina's flag, white and that celeste, light blue. And that became legalized. Rosas was very cunning and came into power in 1829, and people saw him as someone who could be helpful in bringing together Unitarians and Confederates, and that didn't happen. And so once light blue was legalized, then of course you go to green. That's the color of hope in the 19th century. And that you have narratives of soldiers coming in, real narratives from the government saying, and we saw a green razor kit and had it destroyed. So there really was, and there were forcible shavings. That doesn't go to the spirit of coloring, but also the scholar who mentioned hair, beards, the form of the Abraham Lincoln U beard was U for unity. And of course, you would be clean, you'd be lovely and shaved if you were a Confederate. And if you could grow a mustache, you would do that. And if you couldn't, you'd pretty much stick one on right away. But it was very violent. And so I think it begins with color. It ends with public harassment, shaming. I think, Simonetta, you mentioned discipline and punish, and certainly that was part of that process in that regard, yes.
In the famous literary work of Echeverría, El Matadero, the slaughterhouse, he described the divisa punzó that was used in order to represent that there were eyes to Rosa's
Incredible masterwork from Argentina, the slaughterhouse, El Matadero. And that divisa punzó is a crimson insignia that I believe, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but pretty soon after Rosas assumes power, becomes the law. And at the time when Echeverría is writing that, it's not published, it's published posthumously in the 1880s at some point. But Rosas's wife, Encarnación Escurra, has passed away, and therefore it also becomes important to wear a black ribbon to symbolize that. And so the Unitarian in that story, I won't go on but too long, but he is forcibly sodomized. He is killed. He dies of a brain hemorrhage, kind of as a martyr figure. But he is going in as a revolutionary without the crimson insignia, without the black mourning dress, and he's dressed like a Frenchman, like a European, and he's on a horse as a gringo, as the story says. Someone who is European would ride a horse, not as a gaucho would. And so in that, he's very defiant and resistant throughout the story. But you're right, there is so much that is rich in that. And I should finally mention that Echeverria is one of a few writers who is masquerading as a woman writing. And La Moda, which is based on La Mode from France, the French Revolution, is published in the early part of Rosas before the censors figure this out. And one also author is Juan Bautista Alberdi, who writes the first constitution of Argentina. So the founding fathers are masquerading as women writing on fashion, on democratic fashion, and through the fashion press. But Echeverria is publishing in journalism, which is interesting, and not, of course, freely in that story and others that he wrote. You're right.
Are they masquerading as women?
Good question. My theory, and probably someone will have another one, but it was, well, first of all, you wouldn't say who you were because you knew that censors would soon figure it out and be right after you. And
That's a good disguise.
it is a good disguise. But the other one was because very few censors and very few people took fashion with any credibility. And so this early form of non-censored writing during the Rosas period has that feel. And there are all these debates over who is writing this and who are these women. And some were women. Some magazines were indeed, women did use this as an inroad to professionalize or think about what it would be to be a writer in this period, like Juana Manuela Gorriti, for instance, a founding mother. But the masquerade, I think, was in order to defy censors, to give also voice to debates on, and I will tell you, it's pretty wild, democratic hairstyles, I don't know what that would be, or moderately walking shoes, just anything you can imagine, even the kind of furniture you'd have in your house being the color green.
Possible they were like ashamed of writing about fashion, being men, would have been
You
considered
know,
feminine.
Yes, I think that's right.
That's not serious for.
Any other questions from the audience or comments or thoughts? Half thoughts? Take advantage of all the expertise.
I guess I wanted to ask about the transnational dimension a bit. It's very clear in your work, both in the 19th century, where you have, at least based on the presentation, of your work, where you have people dressing in Parisian French style if they're trying to invoke the values of the revolution, and then alternative, which Sarmiento approves of, and British dress is another thing, and then of course in the contemporary period with the example of the artist collective from Chile, the Docena, what's the name of it? It's Los Chicos de la Docena. And I didn't really get much of a sense, Simonetta, from you of transnational influences on Italian fascist dress. I mean, I know if one were talking about fascism in Germany, one probably would say, well, Hitler admired Mussolini, and they drew, the brown shirts drew from the black shirts, or who knows. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, and Maria too. What are the outside in influences on, because these aren't just stories of freestanding countries.
Anything, like I was saying, I don't know origins, but if one hypothesis is some or for some other people, violence, but certainly I don't.
Revolution, I think we have to separate the first 2 years of humanistic revolution before Castro uh, declared unilaterally and taking a lot of people by surprise that the revolution was communist in 1961, 2 years and month after the revolutionary victory of January 1959. So in those first years, I think the major garment, the one who represented the revolution was the fatigues, and it's hard to say how internationally influenced the fatigue is. But in the after 1950, 61, you might see actually a lot of influence of, I don't know if it's influence or it's just a natural process in which communist regimes become legitimized, and once they take power, but you see a lot of discourses that talk about the work clothes and the proletarian aesthetic, and there are this is the same discourse that is repeated again and again in Eastern Europe after 1945 and in the Soviet Union in the early 20s. I cannot tell you or anybody that a phenomenon was a consequence of the other, but you see a lot of the similar phenomena in the different. In 1961, there was a Soviet journalist who wrote in a Cuban publication, so it was considered positive because it was published in Cuba and the press was already owned by the Cuban state, that the Cuban fashion was starting to resemble the Consumos fashion, and this is 1964. So yeah, there were elements that were the same in all over. Tourism of El Che Guevara t-shirt is a way to make the whole revolution becoming something that we can consume globally. And that's another example of politics and fashion put together, because even like young people nowadays, they consume the Che Guevara shirts. So that's a way to consume the revolution. And it was a political statement, not only for people associated with the Cuban Revolution, but it became a symbol for Latin America and for the movements, leftist movements throughout the world. So that's a way to really export a revolution, fashion. From the inside out, yeah, the Cuban Revolution had a major impact, actually in fashion in the world. Beard, long hairs. You can say that it will even impact the rock and roll culture. Exactly.
Socialist revolutions. Fascism, this is
Question for us sociologists at least, and political scientists maybe, is it is a natural process, it is a structural, it comes with a revolution, or it's just that happen or may not. So it is intrinsic to the revolutionary process, and once it becomes a political regime, an institutionalized regime, or not.
Also look at the, Maria, as you mentioned, the early context of the Russian Revolution. You know, Tatlin, Rodchenko, all of those guys were explicitly designing uniforms for workers and designing factories. And so the idea of the worker uniform was built into what they were doing and thinking, you know, and then I think the kind of copying effect comes after. I don't know, going back to the French Revolution, whether one can chart, you know, but even then, I mean, the Fergin hat and, you know, all of that, I mean, there's...
Yeah, but I think
An expression of
uniformity.
uniformity and egalitarianism,
Yeah.
radical egalitarianism. Except for the,
Eliminate the
Back to the uniform. One thinks of it as kind of the antithesis to fashion, and yet as
Of individual identities, you know, some of what also was happening was just making as one went in independence, because there was such a lack of fabric and a lack of buttons and just a lack and pillaging of the corpse in order to take possession of the material. And so it's a very disturbing path, I guess, to think about. But the early uniforms, and perhaps that's why when I was struck by Mariquita Sanchez de Thompson, who is a very well-known author in her own right, and who lived through independence and the Rosas regime, that she would view the British uniforms coming as something to be glorified, when in fact they are invaders. And in 1806 and 1807, she's more struck by how beautiful they look, their aesthetic supremacy, rather than thinking through how in tatters people are, you know, in a very fragmented way, able to win over these invaders. So I don't know if that helps, but answer your question, but it just strikes me as something that, on one hand, the uniform creates consensus. It brings, you know, that possibility of not the individual, but the collective identity, makes it possible, makes it at least perhaps, and yet really when you start to look at the documents, and perhaps that's the danger, the pitfall of the further past you go, that you find more fragments than you do. And perhaps that's where journalism, where fashion journalism and writings from the period help those registers of dress that one cannot find in a museum.
I think that's a lovely note to finish. So yes, thank you so much to all of our speakers. That was really just such interesting material, and all of these speakers have written amazing books, including Regina's, which I see over there. So you can learn more by following up on what they've written.
Estado de moda. I'm going to translate it into cultural expressions and
We'll end on a
consumption in Argentina.
we'll end on a consumer model of selling books. Thanks, everybody.